Untitled on the beat.
What's good, everyone? It's your boy Nati with another video for the channel. Welcome back to DMVSportsZone, and we're at it again. I have Noah here, and we're going to dive into the upcoming fantasy matchups for week three of the NFL season. And having said that, Noah, do you want to say anything to introduce the video, or should we dive right in?
No, ready to dive right in. I think this is going to be an interesting week with Saquon, McCaffrey, Drew Lock, a lot of other relevant fantasy players being out. We're going to have some interesting results this week.
For sure. With that being said, let's just dive right in. With the first question, as always, Noah, can you give me one fantasy sleeper that everyone should keep an eye out for that would probably break out come week 3?
Yeah, I'm going to have to go with a quarterback.
Okay.
And that quarterback's going to be Carson Wentz.
Oh.
Yeah, we predict that Carson Wentz has a strong possibility of having a very similar performance as Ryan Tannehill. They've been developing their passing game in the short and mid, which is a big reason why Tannehill had a big day. Throwing to Jonnu Smith, a lot of different targets in that end zone. So I think in this case, though, interestingly enough, we'll see that Miles Sanders will also do well. It won't be a Derrick Henry negative Tannehill plus type of situation. I think both pass run games are going to benefit this weekend of the Eagles.
It's kind of funny because I also went with another Philadelphia Eagle. But I went with Dallas Goedert, actually, the tight end.
Okay.
I say this largely because the Eagles love to run 2 tight end sets. And, they only have really Jalen Reagor and even sometimes Sean Jackson whenever he's healthy, which is not very often available at the wide receiver position at this point. And Goddard, actually, 2 weeks into the season, this might surprise some people, but he's leading the Eagles with targets with 17 targets over Zach Ertz's 14 targets. And I know Zach Ertz was a high fantasy pick, one of the projected top tight ends this fantasy season. But, Dallas Goedert has been getting most of the targets, has been catching most of the balls from Carson Wentz. So if you have a guy like Carson Wentz, like you project to break out this week, maybe Dallas Goedert might be on the receiving end and not Zach Ertz. And you really just have to go back just 1 week to see Goddard really producing on the field this season as Philly's tight end 1, at least for fantasy purposes, tight end 1. So I definitely think it's a great matchup for him. His matchup against the Bengals is also very tasty. They have a brand new linebacker core. We'll probably miss starting safety Sean Williams on Sunday. They have a pretty middle of the pack defense against tight ends, and several tight ends that they played against last year finished as top 9 options that week. So I think Goddard is in for a pretty good game as a fantasy sleeper, and I'm not just saying that because I have him in one of my teams, but I think he's in for a pretty good game. And this again might shock some people, but I think he's in for a bigger game than Zach Ertz. But we'll see.
No, I definitely we have them. We have got Dallas Goedert as our bounce back candidate. So I think the Eagles, it lines up perfectly for the Eagles against the Bengals defense that, frankly, is struggling keeping teams out of the end zone, but also because the Eagles' offense is the exact counter to what the Bengals struggle with, which is the short run and the intermediate pass. So it might be a big day for the Eagles.
For sure. And having said that, I guess moving on to the second question that we usually have, can you give me 2 great fantasy plays this week for all fantasy owners out there?
Yeah, sure. So we talked about the Eagles already, but I know that a lot of people are curious about other players. So we have 2 running backs that, after this weekend, the landscape of the fantasy field changed a lot for that position. So we have 2 potential breakout players. The 2 are Mike Davis of the Carolina Panthers and Jerick McKinnon of the San Francisco 49ers. So, as you know, Raheem Mostert and Tevin Coleman are both out for San Francisco. For the Panthers, McCaffrey's out for at least 5 weeks. So this is a huge opportunity for Mike Davis to step up. The reason that we have him so highly rated, not only beyond what SportAI calculated, but also a couple other factors that you can't measure. So Brett Rule came out and publicly said that he has confidence in Davis as his long-term starter. They're not going to bring in another guy, similar to how you see Devonta Freeman going to the Giants. they don't have faith in their backups. They don't have faith they can step up. But Mike Davis is going to get that long-term chance to be the starter. So there's that situation. Jerick McKinnon, limited touches, multiple touchdowns. If you get that, for example, last game he only had 6 carries, but he went for over 5 yards a carry. So I know it's the Jets defense, but the Niners lean heavily on the run, especially a dual threat back. So McKinnon going off on Sunday.
Okay. It's funny because I actually put in claims for both in my fantasy league. Because for one, in one of my leagues, I have Christian McCaffrey as my starting back, and he went down. So Mike Davis is definitely a good backup and a good play. And then for Jerick McKinnon, you just said it. Tevin Coleman and Raheem Mostert is likely to be out on Sunday. So 2 good pickups there if you don't already have the 2 players. But with my 2 picks, I actually went with more established guys. So first and foremost, I went with DeAndre Hopkins, obviously the wide receiver for the Cardinals. First and foremost, Hopkins is the guy on the Cardinals receiving core, and he's just getting fed targets every single week by, in my opinion, future MVP candidate and Kyler Murray. Through 2 games, he already has 22 receptions for 217 yards and a touchdown. And that's all on 25 targets. So he's catching a lot of the balls that are thrown his way, and he's also doing a lot with the balls and getting good yardage and also getting to the end zone, as we saw last week against Washington. And he's by far the most targeted receiver in the Arizona receiving core, which makes sense because Arizona did give up assets for him in that inexplicable trade by the Houston Texans this offseason, and they also signed him to a big extension. So it makes sense that he's getting all the targets. And then lastly, as I always do, with the matchup, it's very, very good this week. He goes up against the Lions secondary, which has given up a ton of fantasy points over the last 2 weeks. And rookie Jeffrey Okudah, who was drafted, I believe, from the top of the first round. And the rest of the Lions secondary and defense as a whole has been struggling to start the season. So I think it's a very, very favorable matchup, in my opinion, for DeAndre Hopkins. And I think he's likely to go off this week. I really believe that. And then with my second guy, I'm going to go with Austin Eckler, the running back for the Los Angeles Chargers. Eckler the last 2 weeks has gotten a slightly lighter workload than he did last season, with Joshua Kelly stealing some of his carries on the ground. But Eckler has still been a low-key elite low-end running back 1 to start the season, and even put up 93 rushing yards and 55 receiving yards on 4 catches last week against the Chiefs defense. This week, though, Eckler is playing against arguably the best matchup for a fantasy running back this year in the Panthers defense that gave up 103 yards and 2 touchdowns to recently, just like a couple of weeks ago, signed Leonard Fournette, and 93 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns to Josh Jacobs on the ground alone. So both of those guys produced through the air as well. But that tells you all you need to know about the matchup. And I just think Eckler is going to have a really big week this week.
Yeah, I think that those are good picks there. It's interesting because I think the Lions will bounce back as a secondary. They do have Desmond Trufant, Okudah. They need a mesh, but this is not their week. I think eventually the Lions secondary will come and the defense will form together because they were undergraded defense last year in terms of passer rating and rushing yards allowed. But I definitely agree with that there. I don't think that week 3 is the week for them.
I think so too. I was high on Okudah coming into the draft and stuff, and I still have high hopes for him. It's just, with limited offseason, as we all saw with the pandemic and stuff, it's likely that a lot of teams are starting on a slope just because of that. So we'll see. We'll see if the Lions could, their defense could. But,
sure.
on the flip side of the studs for this week, Noah, can you give me 2 disappointing fantasy duds this week that
Yeah, so we have a couple. Very similar. It's very interesting how the Eagles have the ideal matchup this week, but this week I think on the opposite spectrum, the Browns have a pretty negative outlook.
Yeah.
So someone that I think switch it up from a lot of the common positions, we'll go tight end. Austin Hooper is a candidate to disappoint. He's has a solid start to this season. Obviously, big expectations and a high firepower offense, but a lot of times people need to realize that when you have a lot of stars, you spread the ball.
Mm-hmm.
So Hooper himself on the field hasn't been a terrible player. He gets the catches and targets that he gets. Unfortunately, the main thing about fantasy tight ends is they need red zone touches. Hooper, through the first 2 games, has only gotten 15% of the red zone targets. And I know that the Browns aren't afraid to go and throw a couple of slant routes. We saw with Landry, Odell Beckham, even Kareem Hunt, Nick Chubb. They're trying to include everyone in that game except for Hooper. So the tight ends are getting left out a little bit. I don't see Hooper bouncing back, at least from a fantasy perspective this week.
That's crazy too, because they signed him to a big contract.
Yeah, at the time before the Kittle and the Kelsey extensions, it was actually the biggest free agent signing by a tight end ever. So
Money.
he's got the money, but I don't know he'll bring in the change this week.
And yeah, I mean I agree. Got another pick for disappointing dud this week?
Yeah, so we can go, I guess, to running back in a combination of a different picks because, as I mentioned, Mike Davis and McKinnon are sleepers, particularly for their certain situation. They have a high score plus because they're already in a system that they already know. They've produced similar results from the limited carries they've had in the previous week, so they have the faith of the coaching staff there, and it'll work out well. That's why on the opposite end, I'd be very careful of Devonta Freeman. And all the other running backs that are being affected, especially in LA. Malcolm Brown was that breakout star that we predicted. Shout out the predictions on week 1.
Mm-hmm.
But then you notice that when he was injured, Henderson stepped up. But that is a dangerous situation as well. He's still in the role of a 2-way pass catching back. They would prefer to bring a larger body in there. And Brown is questionable, so he may play this week.
Yeah.
Will more than likely be a game time decision, so I wouldn't risk putting him in, or any of the new running backs besides Davis or McKinnon this week.
No, definitely agree. And then with my disappointing fantasy duds this week, I'm gonna first go with someone who it might surprise some people when I say this, but Deshaun Watson, the quarterback.
Oh, okay.
I think we all know this by now. He's a great real life NFL quarterback, and that was sort of proven with the massive extension that he got in the offseason. But Watson hasn't really been a consistently, right? That term right there, great fantasy quarterback often, and that has pretty much shown throughout the last 2 weeks of the season. He's the 15th ranked fantasy quarterback at this point, and while he did play against the vaunted Ravens defense last week, the week prior, he did play against a middle-of-the-pack Chiefs defense, and he didn't put up the most impressive numbers. So I think it does say something about him starting off slow this season. And in my opinion, you can largely blame that on the trade that we mentioned earlier, the inexcusable trade, where DeAndre Hopkins is now in Arizona. But and this week, Watson gets arguably a worse matchup than he did last week, as he plays against the excellent Pittsburgh Steelers defense, which has been limiting passing attacks the last 2 weeks. So ultimately, I don't think Watson will have a great game this week. And in my opinion, in my leagues, I'd rather go with a guy like Gardner Minshew or Ryan Tannehill, who you guys predicted to have a breakout game last week. Shout out to SportAI. I'd rather go with those 2 guys over Watson this week.
I would definitely have to agree there. Watson, I know that there's a camp that says he'll bounce back. If you saw towards the end of the game, Cooks connected for 95 yards for 6 catches. You can see Stills clicking, so you're seeing the offense click. But if you have to keep in mind, that's also in garbage time when the Ravens were playing a lot more zone defense. So the numbers are a little inflated, and it's intriguing because I don't think David Johnson is going to particularly do bad. He's going to be a solid, flex RB2.
Yes.
But Watson himself is not going to do the best, especially like you said, the other options that are there. Tannehill still on waivers. Even Minshew. Minshew's been on a lot of people's waivers for a while. So
for sure. And with my second pick, I'm gonna go with someone who had a great game on Sunday, and Matt Ryan.
Okay.
Listen, guys, he's usually a great quarterback for you to have on your fantasy team. He usually, he has great games throughout the season, throughout the last decade plus now. And he showed that last week with a 273-yard and 4 touchdown showing against the Cowboys defense. But this week he plays against a much tougher pass defense in the Chicago Bears, which gave up just I looked this up 0.29 fantasy points per pass attempt to Matt Stafford and Daniel Jones the last 2 weeks. In addition to Robert Quinn on that defensive line also boosted the pass rush and pretty much gave them the necessary boost that they needed to really become a dominant defense like we saw 2 years ago. And Bears defense also didn't give up more than 19.9 fantasy points last year to any fantasy quarterback besides Patrick Mahomes. So that tells you all you need to know about the defense and Matt Ryan's fantasy prospects for this week. So I unfortunately think he's going to have a fantasy dud.
I definitely agree with that. It's tough for a decision for that because you kind of go rock in a hard place. You know, you have the Falcons, who are one of the best top 5 best offenses in the league. But you're also going against the Bears, who are a top 5 defense. So it's tough. And if you see the individual matchup, they're really good against the pass rush. You know, the running back for the Falcons has been a question.
Yeah.
And that has not been consistent. That's why they throw it to the air so much. And the Bears secondary is excellent. So, yeah, not looking too great.
Yeah, it's going to be tough. But lastly, as we do every single week, we're going to be discussing our fantasy MVPs for week 3. So, Noah, can you go ahead and give me your fantasy MVP for this upcoming fantasy week?
Yeah, so we actually have a couple picks. But I think for our fantasy MVP, we're going to go with Derrick Henry of the Tennessee Titans for this week.
Said that last week, yeah.
Henry, people think that because he had a pretty quiet fantasy week last week that he's not primed to do well here, but what we saw was that 2 factors that really factor into why he's rated so highly is the number of snaps within the 20-yard line or the red zone, and then the number of rushing attempts per the end zone. So both of the percentages are up in the 85th percentile for all NFL teams. So when they're in the end zone, they're looking to give it to Henry. Yes, Jonas Smith got a couple touchdowns in the red zone last week, but they were looking for Henry through and through. So there's nothing stopping him. He's not slowing down, and he's got a prime matchup and a weak rushing defense. So I'm excited for Derrick Henry. I think he's going to be our MVP for this week.
Hopefully though, I mean, I remember like picking him as the fantasy MVP last week, and I pretty much said like the same sort of things, like a weak rush defense and stuff, but he didn't really have a great game last week. Hopefully he bounces back in his sort of way, right? Because, you know, he had, I think he still had double-digit like points, but for him, that's not, you know,
the standard's higher,
yeah. So, but yeah, I definitely agree. I think we will have a bounce back week, at least for him, coming Sunday. For me, I'm gonna go with someone who just demolished my Washington football team this past weekend, in Kyler Murray, the quarterback for the Cardinals. First and foremost, look at Murray, man, so inspirational. No, seriously though, I told everyone in the offseason that Kyler Murray was gonna be a contention for the fantasy and real life MVP this year, and I'm sticking to it. He has shown me nothing for me to move away from that. He's been great through both the air, and I would especially say on the ground. On the ground, I mean, yeah, he's breaking ankles out there. Yeah, 3 touchdowns. Last week, I think it was 2 on the ground, which of course is like most important for fantasy football purposes, right? Because, you know, you score 6 points for every rushing touchdown. But usually in standard leagues, only 4 for passing touchdowns. The only thing you really need to know about Kyler Murray at this point is that he has the 4th most fantasy points at the quarterback position right now, and he's played against the extremely talented 49ers defensive line before they went down with a lot of injuries this past week, and the Washington defensive line. So he's putting up that many fantasy points against those 2 pretty tough defensive lines. I mean, that says all you need to know. And then this week, as I mentioned before with DeAndre Hopkins, he's playing one of the worst defenses in football at this moment in the Detroit Lions that have been putrid at both stopping the run, as we saw last week. I think Aaron Jones went off. He had like 45 fantasy points. Yeah, he 165 rushing and then almost 190 plus on the ground combined, which is not going to win you football games. and they haven't been too great through the air as well. I know Aaron Rodgers didn't have the most spectacular games, but you can just look 2 weeks back and look at Mitch Trubisky throwing for I think 260 yards and 3 touchdowns. So I think Kyler Murray, man, is the week 3 fantasy quarterback, no question.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think that's a solid pick. You can't go wrong there.
Yeah. Noah, I think that's pretty much it for the weekly fantasy football talk for week 3. Noah, you want to plug that so special platform that everyone needs to know about right now?
Yeah, for sure. Nati and I are talking about it. That platform is SportAI. Where we get our numbers, where the Score Plus comes from, and where we've got the strong results and the strong predictions, calling to Ryan Tannehill, Malcolm Brown, James Robinson, that's coming from our platform. So basically, to summarize, it's a mobile app integrated with artificial intelligence that helps anyone optimize their fantasy sports lineups and helps you understand fantasy sports analytics.
Mm-hmm.
We're currently in beta right now, and that's where a lot of our feedback's coming from. And we got a lot of excited users that have already won in fantasy and really want to understand more about fantasy sports analytics for free, if I mention. So just check out the link in the description of this video and to learn more, and excited to keep predicting and hopefully keep killing our fantasy seasons, right? So
sure. And
thanks for having me on.
And those predictions that you mentioned, James Robinson, Ryan Tannehill, those were like really impressive. But for me, the most impressive one was a player that I think most people, if not all people, except SportAI was down on last week, in Melvin Gordon against that Pittsburgh defense. And Noah, I remember he told me, because I predicted that he would be a dud last week. I remember Noah specifically saying that SportAI was actually high on him and actually thought that he was going to have a pretty decent game. And at that moment, I was like, what? Like, really? It's Pittsburgh? But no, they were right. And yeah, again, just make sure you guys look up SportAI and make sure you're on it, because it's a really good platform and it really does help fantasy football users. It's helped me so far. So yeah.
Appreciate it, man. Appreciate it. It's good to come on to DMVSportsZone, one of the fastest growing shows in the DMV. So you gotta tune in. He's giving up the deets, the juicy deets on the local sports. So definitely appreciate it.
For sure. And that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. As usual, please make sure to like, comment, subscribe to the DMV Sports Zone channel. We try to post fire content as much as possible on here. We also have an Instagram page, all lowercase DMV Sports Zone, and a Twitter page at DMV Sports Zone, where we try to post fire content every now and then on there as well. So thank you, Noah, again so much for being on this video. It's always fun with these weekly previews, and
for sure, I'm
excited for this weekend. It should be a fun one, and really wraps up with that Ravens-Chiefs game, which is something I know all of us are looking forward to. So yeah, definitely gonna be a fun weekend.
Yeah, definitely. Appreciate it.
Peace, guys.